He controlled the city's most lethal underworld syndicate from the shadows of an international shipping empire, and he had never once been caught off guard until a chaotic Thursday afternoon when his armed enforcers failed to contain a warehouse riot and an exhausted logistics coordinator stepped right into the crossfire. She didn't cower, she didn't beg for her life, she simply leveled a glare that could freeze blood and single-handedly brought a room full of killers to a dead halt. And in that single moment, the most dangerous man in the city found the one thing he didn't know he was looking for. What happens when an invisible, overworked woman accidentally outsmarts the mafia and becomes the only asset a ruthless boss will burn the city down to protect? Stay with me until the very end. If this story hooks you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The golden hour sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows the way it always did on a Friday evening. Not politely, not softly, but all at once, in a blinding wave that unapologetically highlighted the towering stacks of neglected paperwork left behind by lazy superiors. It washed over the glass walls of the logistics department, sending every sensible corporate employee scrambling for the elevators the very second the clock struck 5. Wang So was not a sensible employee. He was, however, a man who demanded absolute order. He walked through the deserted bullpen at exactly 6:42 p.m., moving with a silent, predatory grace that completely betrayed his legitimate executive title. A low, controlled energy radiated from him, muting the distant hum of the city below the reinforced glass. He approached the only desk still illuminated by a monitor's glow, his mind replaying how she had dismantled his crisis hours earlier. He leaned over the chaotic spread of shipping manifests, his tailored dark suit absorbing the dying light. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hand gently framing her face as Kayla looked up from her work, her breath catching in her throat as she finally saw the man hiding behind the corporation. The corporate offices of Pan-Pacific Shipping were designed to be transparent. Glass walls, open floor plans, a panopticon of modern efficiency. But from the elevated steel catwalk of the executive tier, Wang So saw only the rot beneath the polish. He stood in the shadows, perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto the logistics bullpen 3 stories below. His mind kept returning to the docks, a multi-million-dollar shipment, a standoff with rogue enforcers, his own armed men reaching for their weapons, and then her, a woman with a clipboard and a faded headset, radiating absolute exhaustion, who had stepped directly into the crossfire and verbally dismantled the shipping foreman until the riot simply dissolved into confused silence. Kayla. He had demanded her personnel file the moment he returned to the tower. It was a pathetic document, listing an entry-level salary and a stagnant title for a woman whose hyper-efficient routing algorithms were the only reason his legitimate corporate front hadn't collapsed under its own weight. Now, watching her from above, the data transformed into a visceral reality. It was approaching 9 o'clock. The floor was deserted except for her desk, an island of glaring white monitor light in the dim expanse. A sharp clack of dress shoes broke the quiet as a mid-level manager, a man Wang So recognized as Director Choi, approached her cubicle. Choi casually dumped a massive stack of padded manifests directly onto her keyboard, knocking over a half-empty paper coffee cup in the process. Even from this height, Wang So could see the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way she closed her eyes for a fraction of a second before looking up. Choi meaned in, his body language aggressive and dismissive, jabbing a finger at the spilled mess and then at the files. The exact words didn't carry up to the catwalk, but the venom was unmistakable. He was leaving for the weekend, she was expected to fix his department's catastrophic errors before Monday morning. A cold, heavy knot tightened in Wang So's chest. He was a man who had built a criminal empire on loyalty, mutual respect, and calculated violence. He did not tolerate parasites. Choi smirked,
turning on his heel and walking toward the executive elevators, completely oblivious to the apex predator tracking his every step from the shadows above. Wang So watched Kayla carefully dab at the spilled coffee with a crumpled napkin, her face a heartbreaking mask of weary resignation as she opened the first folder. She didn't know it yet, but that was the last time anyone would ever speak to her that way. The underworld boss pulled his phone from his tailored jacket, pressing a single speed dial number. Choi's access is permanently revoked, Wang So murmured, his voice a low, lethal hum in the empty corridor. Clear his office and prepare an immediate executive transfer for the logistics coordinator. He hung up, his gaze lingering on the solitary woman below. She had saved his empire in the mud and chaos of the shipping yards. The least he could do is burn down her personal hell.
Monday morning arrived with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the bitter taste of stale break room coffee. Kayla hadn't slept. She had spent the entire weekend untangling the disastrous routing errors Director Choi had dumped on her desk, only to discover a glaring anomaly deep within the system, a massive, unauthorized reroute of shipping containers that screamed of corporate embezzlement. Before she could even process the implications, Choi stormed into the bullpen. His face was flushed, a sheen of nervous sweat betraying the aggressive swagger in his step. He didn't wait for her to speak. "Pack your desk," Choi barked, his voice echoing sharply across the open floor plan and drawing the wide-eyed stares of 50 other employees. He slammed a formal termination notice directly over her keyboard. "You're done, Kayla. I warned you about these persistent data entry failures. Now a critical overseas shipment is inexplicably stalled, and I will not let your glaring incompetence drag my department down." Kayla stared at the paper, the sheer injustice of the accusation stealing the air from her lungs. She had just spent 48 hours salvaging his catastrophic mess. She opened her mouth to defend herself, her fingers grazing the printed evidence of his illicit routing, but the words died in her throat. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The ambient, nervous chatter of the bullpen vanished entirely, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Wang So walked through the glass double doors. He didn't stride or hurry. He moved with that same lethal, predatory grace, his dark presence commanding absolute submission from the entire floor. Two massive men in immaculate suits flanked him, but all eyes were fixed on the underworld boss masquerading as a CEO. He bypassed the terrified executives who scrambled to bow, his gaze locked entirely on the confrontation at Kayla's cubicle. Choi paled, the aggressive flush draining from his face as he hastily bowed. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption. I am just handling a low-level termination." "You are handling nothing," Wang So interrupted. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that carried effortlessly through the dead silence. He didn't even look at the sweating manager. He stepped directly into Kayla's space, his dark eyes dropping to the termination notice before meeting her exhausted, defiant gaze. Wang So picked up the paper and tore it smoothly in half. Director Choi's security clearance was revoked on Friday night. His severance is currently being calculated against the millions he attempted to siphon through unauthorized shipping lanes. Choi made a choked, terrified sound as the two suited men moved in, gripping him by the arms and silently dragging him toward the elevators. Wang So finally leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable, though a dangerous spark lit his dark eyes. "You no longer report to logistics. Gather your things. Your new office is on the executive tier. You are now the director of global operations, and you answer to no one but me." The executive tier was a different world entirely. Gone were the harsh fluorescent lights and the chaotic clamor of the logistics bullpen. Here, high above the sprawling city, the air was cool, the carpets thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps, and the silence absolute. Kayla sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, her fingers flying across a dual-monitor setup that displayed routing algorithms far more complex than anything she had ever encountered. Wang So had called them special projects. They were high-priority, off-the-books shipments that required the utmost discretion and flawlessly efficient pathways to bypass standard customs checkpoints. Kayla didn't ask questions. For the first time in her life, she was being handed a puzzle worthy of her intellect, entirely free from the suffocating incompetence of her former superiors. She rerouted entire fleets with a few keystrokes, finding blind spots in maritime surveillance networks and tightening delivery windows down to the minute. She thought she was optimizing a cutting-edge corporate supply chain. She had no idea she was streamlining the veins of the city's most dangerous criminal syndicate. "You're shifting the Busan container through the eastern corridor," a low voice murmured. Kayla gasped, her hands freezing on the keyboard. She hadn't heard the heavy oak doors open. Wang So stood just inches behind her chair, so close she could feel the faint, dark heat radiating from his suit. The scent of him, cedar, cold rain, and something sharp and undefinable, wrapped around her, making her pulse suddenly hammer against her ribs. It shaves 4 hours off the transit time," she managed to say, struggling to keep her voice steady as she stared at the glowing data on her screen. She didn't dare turn around. If she did, she would be face to face with the intense, unblinking focus of a man who commanded the world around him simply by existing in it. The eastern corridor has a narrow window where the automated inspection grid runs a diagnostic reset. If I thread the shipment through there, it sails straight into the harbor completely undetected. A heavy, weighted silence hung in the dim office. She felt him shift, leaning over her shoulder to inspect the monitor. His arm braced against the edge of her desk, caging her in. "Flawless," he breathed. The word wasn't directed at the screen. Kayla finally turned her head, only to find Wang So looking directly at her, his dark eyes tracing the tired but triumphant lines of her face. The proximity was intoxicating, a slow-burn magnetic pull that made the towering corporate empire around them vanish entirely. For a man who controlled every variable in his brutal life with an iron fist, Wang So found himself utterly mesmerized by the woman who was unknowingly handing him the keys to the city, completely unaware of the lethal power she now wielded. The new predictive logistics software Kayla had designed was a masterpiece of efficiency, a frictionless digital web that caught every anomaly in the supply chain. For 2 weeks, she had run Wang So's priority projects through her optimized algorithms, streamlining his complex pathways with surgical precision. She was deeply proud of her work. She was also completely unaware that she had just deployed a hypersensitive surveillance net directly over the city's criminal underworld. It happened at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The executive floor was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the servers and the soft, steady patter of rain against the reinforced glass. Kayla sat bathed in the glow of her dual monitors, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the digital representation of the port's nocturnal activities pulse across the screen in calming waves of blue and green. Then, a flashing crimson alert fractured the calm. Kayla frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. Her system had snagged on a massive anomaly. A massive convoy of 20 heavy-duty shipping containers manifested as agricultural machinery, bound for a secluded secondary dock. On paper, the routing was flawless, possessing all the correct bureaucratic stamps and automated customs approvals. But her algorithm didn't just read paper. It analyzed weight distributions, the fuel consumption rates of the transport vessels, and the historical traffic patterns of the designated dock. The data was violently mismatched. The reported weight of the machinery didn't align with the deep hull displacement of the freighters. The destination dock had been abandoned for commercial use 3 years prior. It was a ghost shipment, hidden perfectly in plain sight. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the digital signatures back to a labyrinth of shell companies. The deeper she dug, the more aggressively the external network fought back, throwing up encrypted firewalls that only confirmed her suspicions. Someone was using Pan Pacific's infrastructure to move something massive, unregistered, and deeply illegal. Assuming it was a catastrophic lingering error from the remnants of Director Choi's corrupt tenure, Kayla didn't hesitate. She engaged the system's absolute override.
With a single decisive keystroke, Kayla initiated a total lockdown on the grid. Crimson digital locks slammed shut across the map. The automated cranes at the secondary dock powered down. The digital gate passes for the incoming transport trucks were instantly revoked and flagged for federal inspection. In less than 30 seconds, she had completely paralyzed the entire operation. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, satisfied that she had protected Wang So's company from whatever illicit scheme Choi had left behind. She picked up her tea, confident the crisis was averted. 3 miles away, in the rain-slicked shadows of the harbor, a small army of heavily armed men belonging to the brutal Baiho faction stared in lethal, panicked confusion as their multi-million-dollar weapons shipment ground to a screeching, permanent halt. Kayla didn't know it. She hadn't just frozen a shipment. She had just fired the first shot in an underworld war.
In the subterranean levels of an abandoned slaughterhouse in the city's industrial district, the air was thick with the metallic stench of iron and the frantic crackle of a scrambled radio transmission. Kang Dae-jung, the brutal leader of the rival Baekho faction, stared at the encrypted tablet in his scarred hands. The screen blinked with a single, damning notification. Access denied. Cargo quarantined. Millions of dollars in untraceable weaponry, completely paralyzed on the secondary docks. It wasn't a system glitch, a bruised lieutenant stammered, kneeling on the wet concrete floor. The port network was manually overwritten. We traced the digital footprint back to Pan Pacific's executive tier. Someone deliberately locked us out. Dae-jung's jaw tightened. Wang So's legitimate shipping front was famously impenetrable, but this was different. This wasn't a brute force hack. This was a surgical strike. The sudden lockdown had anticipated their alternate routing, severed their false digital manifests, and triggered federal alarms with terrifying precision. Whoever had executed this maneuver wasn't a standard corporate drone. Wang So has acquired a new counterintelligence asset, a ghost in his machine, someone who knows our blind spots better than we do. He motioned to a technician in the corner who brought up a heavily pixelated security image intercepted from Pan Pacific's lobby. It was Kayla, exhausted, unassuming, carrying a stack of padded envelopes through the turnstiles. "That is the architect," the technician confirmed. Her terminal initiated the freeze. Dae-jung studied the image, letting a cold, humorless smile curve his lips. It was a brilliant, deeply insulting disguise. To the untrained eye, she was an overworked, downtrodden office worker. But to Dae-jung, she was the most dangerous weapon Wang So had ever deployed. She was a master operative, hiding in plain sight, purposefully dismantling the Baekho faction's supply lines without firing a single shot. "Put the word out to every shadow broker and hitter in the city," Dae-jung ordered, his eyes never leaving Kayla's pixelated face. 2 billion won for the woman. If Wang So wants to play chess, we will take his absolute best piece before she even knows the game has started. If you want to see how Kayla and Wang So navigate this deadly underworld war, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know what you think will happen next. The first warning wasn't an alarm. It was a sound that didn't belong anywhere near the executive tier, the sharp, metallic ping of a suppressed gunshot shattering the reinforced glass of the exterior elevator bank. Kayla didn't even have time to register the spiderweb crack blooming across the floor-to-ceiling windows before the lights abruptly cut out. Plunged into sudden darkness, the glow of her dual monitors cast eerie blue shadows across the sprawling office. She stood up, completely disoriented, but before she could speak, a massive hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her violently down beneath the heavy mahogany desk. "Do not make a sound," Wang So breathed against her ear. His voice was impossibly calm, a chilling contrast to the heavy, tactical footfalls now echoing down the hallway. He moved over her, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable physical shield between her trembling frame and the open office.
The scent of him, cedar, rain, and the distinct cold tang of gunpowder was overwhelming in the tight space. In the dim monitor light, Kayla saw the dull gleam of a matte black firearm in his free hand. He wasn't acting like a corporate CEO facing an emergency. He was acting like a man who killed for a living. "They aren't corporate," Wang So whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness above the desk. "They're backhoe, and they are here for you." Before she could process the sheer absurdity of the statement, the glass doors to her suite exploded inward. Gunfire tore through the room, shredding her monitors and raining sparks and tempered glass over them. Wang So didn't flinch. He pressed Kayla flat against the thick mahogany carpet, covering her body entirely with his own, as the mahogany desk absorbed the punishing barrage. "Stay behind me. If we lose contact, run for the service stairwell." He didn't wait for her to agree. In a single fluid motion of terrifying violence, Wang So surged upward. 2 staccato shots rang out, instantly silencing the incoming fire. He grabbed Kayla's hand, pulling her to her feet and propelling her forward into the chaos. They sprinted through the ruined executive suite. The towering glass walls that had once felt like a symbol of her hard-earned success now felt like a fragile, glittering cage. Shadows moved in the corridor. Wang So pushed her behind a heavy concrete pillar, leaning out to fire with ruthless precision. Every movement he made was calculated and lethal, a predator viciously defending its territory and its prize. Kayla's breath came in ragged gasps, her fingers gripping the fabric of his tailored suit jacket like a lifeline. She had optimized his operations, analyzed his data, and streamlined his empire. But as another wave of assassins breached the floor and Wang So pulled her tight against his chest to shield her from a shower of shattered glass, she finally understood the terrifying reality of the man she had been working for. He wasn't just a boss, he was the apex predator of a hidden world, and he was currently tearing his way through the skyline just to keep her alive. The rain was still hammering against the steel roof of the safe house, a rhythmic drumming that felt entirely too loud in the suffocating silence of the underground bunker. Kayla sat on the edge of a heavy leather sofa, her hands trembling as she stared at the dried blood on Wang So's cuffs. They had barely outrun the assault at the glass tower, vanishing into a subterranean network of private tunnels only he seemed to know existed. Wang So stood across the dimly lit room, his back to her. He had stripped off his ruined suit jacket, revealing a tactical holster across his broad, tense shoulders. He was staring at a bank of encrypted monitors, his jaw clenched so tight it looked carved from granite. "They hit the 34th floor exactly 3 minutes after the automated security shift," he said, his voice a lethal, vibrating quiet that chilled her to the bone. "They bypassed the outer perimeter without triggering a single infrared sensor. They didn't sweep the building, Kayla. They came straight to your office." Kayla swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around her. The adrenaline was finally crashing, leaving a cold, sharp dread in its wake. "You're saying they knew exactly where I was." "I'm saying they knew exactly who you were," Wang So corrected, turning to face her. The predator was fully unleashed now, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, calculated rage. "I built this empire on loyalty," he whispered, a dangerous promise echoing in the small space. "But I will dismantle every single piece of it to find the rat who put a target on your back." If you want to see who betrayed Wang So and how Kayla takes her revenge, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with your best theories on the traitor's identity. The industrial elevator groaned as it ascended the main port control tower, carrying Kayla far above the labyrinth of steel shipping containers. She adjusted the earpiece linking her to Wang So, her pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had volunteered for this. The Baiko faction wanted the architect of their ruin, and the traitor in Wang So's inner circle would inevitably leak her location if she exposed herself. It was a terrifying, calculated gamble to draw them all into the open.
Below her, the shipyards were a maze of rain-slicked shadows and blinding floodlights. Wang So was down there, a phantom stalking through the steel canyons. He wasn't just protecting her anymore, he was excising a cancer from his own empire. Stepping out of the elevator into the glass-walled observation deck, Kayla immediately approached the master terminal. Her fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard, completely bypassing the standard port security protocols. She wasn't just freezing the Baco faction's assets this time. She was permanently seizing them, digitally transferring ownership of every smuggled weapon and illicit container directly into Pan-Pacific's impenetrable corporate shell. "Terminal accessed," she breathed into the comms, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Transfer initiated. 2 minutes to total seizure." "Hold your position," Wang So's voice crackled in her ear, dangerously low and thick with lethal focus. They took the bait. Gunfire abruptly shattered the heavy ambient noise of the port. From her vantage point high above, Kayla watched the muzzle flashes ignite in the darkness, like violent lightning between the stacks of containers. Down in the mud and the rain, Wang So moved with the terrifying fluid grace of a true apex predator. He wasn't just fighting, he was systematically dismantling the heavily armed Baco kill squad that had come to claim the bounty on her head. "Kayla, the transfer," Wang So ordered over the comms, followed by the sharp metallic crack of his weapon discharging. 90 seconds, Kayla's eyes locked on the agonizingly slow progress bar. Suddenly, the heavy steel door to the observation deck hissed open. Kayla spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway, soaked in rain and gripping a suppressed pistol, was the last person she expected to see. It wasn't a Baco assassin. It was Kang, Wang So's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had stood guard outside her office only days before. The traitor. "Step away from the console, Kayla," Kang said, his voice flat and dead. "You're a brilliant girl, but you're ruining a very lucrative side business." "Wang So," Kayla whispered into the mic, not daring to break eye contact with the gun leveled at her chest. "It's Kang. He's in the tower." A deadly, chilling silence fell over the comms before Wang So's voice returned, vibrating with a promise of absolute carnage. "I'm coming." The storm that had raged over the city for 3 days finally broke, leaving the morning sky a bruised, brilliant purple. Inside the newly restored executive boardroom of Pan-Pacific Shipping, the atmosphere was fundamentally changed. The long mahogany table, once a place where lazy superiors dumped their catastrophic failures, was now the absolute center of gravity for both a legitimate international conglomerate and the most lethal syndicate in the city. Kayla stood at the head of it. She wore a sharply tailored suit that mirrored the lethal elegance of the man standing silently at the window behind her. She was no longer the exhausted logistics coordinator buried under padded manifests. The massive digital map dominating the far wall was her domain now. With a few decisive keystrokes, she finalized the complete absorption of the Baco faction's remaining supply lines, routing their seized assets through her impenetrable shadow network. The rival empire was entirely dismantled, erased by her algorithms and Wang So's ruthless execution in the shipping yards. The remaining executives, those who had survived the purge of Kang and his co-conspirators, sat in terrified, awed silence. They didn't dare look at Wang So. Their eyes were entirely fixed on Kayla. "The eastern corridor is secured," Kayla announced, her voice calm, authoritative, and carrying a razor-sharp edge that commanded absolute obedience. "All future priority shipments will route exclusively through my secondary diagnostic grid. Any deviation from these pathways will be considered an act of treason against this company. Are we understood?" A chorus of hasty, breathless agreements echoed around the table. She dismissed them with a single, sharp nod. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the fleeing executives, the terrifying aura of the boardroom softened into something private and electric.
Wang So turned from the window, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't walk. He prowled toward the head of the table, the apex predator finally at rest in the presence of his equal. He stopped beside her, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw, a mirror of the moment he had first revealed himself in the dim light of the logistics bullpen. But there was no fear left in her now, only a burning, matched intensity. "They are terrified of you," Wang So murmured, a dangerous, deeply satisfied smirk at the corners of his mouth. The untouchable queen of operations. Kayla leaned into his touch, her own smile reflecting the terrifying power she now wielded. "They should be. I learned from the most dangerous man in the city." He closed the remaining distance, his lips brushing hers in a promise of absolute devotion and shared empire. They had survived the fire, and now the city belonged entirely to them. If you loved Kayla's journey from an overworked office worker to the untouchable queen of the underworld, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me what kind of story you want to see next.
And just like that, the exhausted logistics coordinator became the untouchable queen of the underworld. If Kayla and Wang So's journey kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next thrilling adventure. I love seeing how far this community stretches, so before you go, drop a comment below and let me know exactly where in the world you are watching from. I'll be down there replying to as many of you as I can. Until next time.